Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics. Today we have on Dr. Lorraine Besser, and we're going to be talking about her book, The Art of Interesting: What We Miss in Our Pursuit of the Good Life and How to Cultivate It. Welcome to the show, Dr. Besser.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and speak with you all.
Well, I have to say, and I said just a second when we were off the air, that I had to learn or relearn a new way of speaking about the word interesting after reading your book. So the experience of reading the book was interesting. And I have to say that there are so many layers to this book that I had to go back and read a couple of the chapters again after I would read something else. What made you want to write this book, The Art of Interesting?
Yeah, so I have been working on a research project in collaborate. I'm a philosopher, and I've been working on a research project in collaboration with a psychologist. And what we've done is try to explore this set of experiences that we think are really important to the good life, but hadn't really been recognized by anybody. And so the set of experiences are we call psychologically rich experiences. And these are experiences that there's a set of experiences that often challenge us, that are often novel, complex. And the key thing about them is that they have this particular impact of the mind on the mind that I describe in terms of being interesting. And so uh, these experiences, they create these interesting experiences. And I wrote the book because I think this is just so important to talk about. I myself have gotten into this place where, you get really caught up with things like achieving and working and all the things that go in that category. And, sometimes you feel like you work so hard and then all you have time left for is, like to just do something very basic, and to go for like kind of pleasant experiences that don't really test you. But there's this whole different kind of area that we could be exploring in our time. I think we have the time for it, and if we take the time to think about what makes for interesting experiences and to give them priority in our lives are going to just be much better.
I thought we could define a few of the terms so
Yeah.
that our listeners understand. You talk a lot in the book about a good life and psychological richness, which you just mentioned. When we think of a good life, and you talk about this in the first half of the book, we think about happiness and finding meaning and purpose, but we don't think of it in terms of psychological richness. So, could you kind of define those two terms in reference to how you talk about them in the book?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So when I talk or think about the good life, what I'm thinking about are the kinds of experiences that would make our lives good. And so typically researchers have focused on two areas of the good life, as you described it, meaningfulness and happiness, right? So we hear a lot about this all the time, right? Clearly, we hear a lot about happiness, and we also hear a lot about the importance of, finding some kind of meaning in our lives through, again, through work, through finding a purpose, through volunteering, things like that. And these are really important things to our lives, right? I think both dimensions of this are really important parts of the good life. But I worry that if we stick with only these two parts, we'll really be missing out on a lot of what life has to offer. And that's where the psychological richness comes in. Our research has shown that psychological richness is, again, these experiences that have this impact on our minds, that psychological richness is actually very different from meaningfulness and happiness. And so we're not necessarily going to get it if we're just pursuing happiness and we're just pursuing meaning. And I think for a lot of us, the more that we focus on happiness and meaning, right, the more we are going to end up unable to prioritize psychological richness in our lives and interesting experiences. And so we'll live, I think, an overall impoverished life just by sticking to these two areas.
When I was reading the book, I was trying to absorb in the very beginning what you were saying, and it wasn't until you discussed Seinfeld that I really kind of picked up on, okay, this is what she means. And I think it's such a good analogy of happiness and finding it's you're not going to be happy all the time. Can you
Yeah.
talk about Seinfeld and why you use that show to kind of
Yeah.
use it as an analogy for happiness?
Yeah, thank you. I loved this. I love this example. So, when you think of Seinfeld, right, they're not actually, you don't necessarily think of really happy people, right? They're
Right.
complaining all the time. They're sometimes mean. But what they do is the gang of Seinfeld will kind of join together to celebrate a happy moment, and they do this through a happy dance. So there are several different places where this comes up in over the long series. One that stands out to me is an episode where they're in Los Angeles. And I don't really know even why they were in a courtroom in Los Angeles, and someone must have been in trouble, and they come out to the steps and they're celebrating, you know, whatever good things happened in the courtroom. But they come out of the steps and they just sit there, and it's Kramer and George and Jerry, and they just sit there and they just dance and they just cheer and they dance. And that to me is the epitome of happiness. And it feels so good. And it's so great to share amongst people and to really let it sink in. And so that's so huge and important. But, it goes away. And once you celebrate it, you experience it, you let it fill yourself. But then very quickly, these feelings are going to fade away. And my worry is that I believe this is just the nature of how happiness works, so that the kind of long-term feelings, intense feelings of pleasure that are so characterized by that happy dance, that these long-term feelings are just simply unsustainable in to keep up. And so they're short-lived by their nature. And so I think this teaches a really important lesson about this, which is that we should be more like Seinfeld, right? We should enjoy the moments when they come for us and really take it in, the happy moments. But then, we should walk away and really not stress about it when we don't have it. So I think that means like pursuing it less, experiencing it more, but also reserving time in our lives for other things.
I think Kramer was trying to be an actor. I think
Was
that's
that
the why
it?
they were in LA, and something about like a murder happened and they arrested him. It's all coming back to me now
Yeah,
as you're
yeah.
talking about
Kramer
it.
was arrested there and then he got off. And so, yeah.
It's all coming back as you're saying that. But so striving for happiness, for fulfillment, why is that? Like, what does that leave us with? If we're striving for it, you talk about in the book that we're missing those small moments. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit more about the small moments?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess first let's think about how when we're striving for things, we tend to block out the small moments. So just even by definition, when we're striving for something, we're fixated on an end goal, and if we're striving for it, we're really like thinking, how do I get there? Okay. And if something comes at you and it helps you to get there, then like you think it's good. If it's not helping you, then it's not worth your time. And so when we're striving like this, we really exclude a lot of the moments of our lives from potentially enriching ourselves. And I think interesting experiences really arise or can arise in these small moments, that we can have very interesting experiences if we let ourselves, through walking to work, or through waiting in a dentist office, or all of these small moments that I think typically are kind of wasted time for us. We can really learn just how to make those more interesting. And really the cumulative effect of doing this is going to be to enrich our lives.
And how can we be more aware of the small moments? How can we find interesting things that happen in the very, I would say, mundane routine of daily life?
Yeah, thank you. In the book, I describe a kind of mindfulness that I think is a really important first step. And I call it mindfulness 2.0 to make clear that I'm not talking about the normal kind of mindfulness. And so typically when we think of mindfulness, right, it originated as this concept that derives from Buddhism, where we can develop this awareness of our thought patterns. And by developing this awareness of our thought patterns, then we're better able uh, to notice when our mind leads to places of anxiety or things like that. And so I think that's a really important skill. And what I'm encouraging us to think about is how we can use that skill of noticing and turn it outside of ourselves. And so bring that same kind of way in which we can be mindful of our own minds and start to be mindful of and notice things in our environment. And I think one of the key things that happens in both kinds of mindfulness, but really important to noticing things, is that we do this without evaluating, right? We just take up this non-judgy perspective and we just notice things without always being quick to, judge them as important or not or anything. And that's the kind of attitude that I think will really help us to generate interesting experiences from even the little things simply by noticing features of your environment that'll tap you into something that might stimulate your mind to have interesting thoughts.
You incorporate uh, a conversation about our foundations in the book. And I think that plays
Yeah.
into our what we're talking about now because it is really hard not to place judgment. And when you place judgment, it comes from a personal place of your
Yeah.
own upbringing. How can you create a better foundation so you're not immediately looking at something that could potentially be an interesting experience and judging it saying it's not worth my time?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I I think the more we are aware of our foundations and what we're what our natural tendencies are, then the more we can notice and think about whether we want them. And, so one thing I think, we all have been influenced. We are adult creatures, and we've been influenced by our societies, by our various communities, by our families. And many of these can be very extraordinary ways. But sometimes I feel like we can be influenced in ways that maybe aren't really true to how we feel as adults or really true to how we want to go about thinking about things. And I think that if we just kind of practice thinking about what it is that we're really valuing in life, and then think about where it came from, right? So I present an exercise in the book where like we'll make a list of the things that you really value, and then think, right, which are ones that, these are ones that society tends to support, right? And try to encourage you to think about once you've got them, like where did they come from? And it may, through this process, I think we'll find that, sometimes they came from places and we feel that they support us and they work for us. But I also think sometimes we'll find that we have these kind of things that we're holding up to be important. And we're doing that because, somebody told us to a long time ago, or society tells us to do. And I really want to encourage us to break free from that, or, and just by being aware of it and to think for ourselves about whether or not this is something, society might be telling me to do this, but, is it really something that I want to do that will make my life go better?
I think another thing that you talk about in the book that resonated for me was the fact that it can be vicarious experiences that you're watching some like for example I fall down the rabbit hole of documentaries. I can watch documentaries for hours. Other people's experiences I find quite interesting, but you don't think about that as in terms of your own good life, like that's someone else's experiences. Can you talk about how vicariously watching someone else's experiences can actually add to your own good life?
Yeah, yeah. So if we think about what an interesting experience is, right? It's basically happening in our mind. When we're having an interesting experiences, we find that our minds are engaged, we're curious, we're thinking about new things, we're making new connections, we're feeling new feelings, and all of this stuff is really happening within our minds. And so whether or not we are, for example, traveling to a distant foreign country to have a new experience that we'll find very stimulating and engaging, we could actually, just watch a documentary that takes us there and it can generate the really same effects. And as you know, documentaries, I think, are a great example of this, as our podcasts, right? I hope we're delivering an interesting experience and leading people to think and question and engage. And so I think, yeah, the message here is that it doesn't, we don't have to go too far to find these things. And we can just open a book or find a documentary or do something to stimulate our minds. And however we're getting it, whether we're getting it through the vicarious experience of learning or watching others or doing things ourselves, the effect on our minds will be similar. It'll deliver interesting experiences for us.
You use an example also in the book about, if someone's like, I don't know what I find interesting. I don't, you gave like 10 different things and what sparked your aha moment. And I know I was reading them and the examples were like Hawaii has the most beautiful sunsets. And you're like, yeah, that's true, whatever. But for myself, when I read about how the circulatory system is more than 60,000 miles long, I was like, what? And then all of a sudden I went, oh, I get the exercise because that stopped me to go, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, that's so for people who don't know what they really think is going to be interesting, how to add that element to their life, do they just
Yeah.
kind of go searching? Where do they go?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope they go to my book because, a large part of this book is telling you how to kind of cultivate a mindset about that'll help you be more open to your experiences. But one of the things that I think, so this list that you're talking about, so it's just a random list of facts that I pulled up, and I find it's such a source of interest, right? And one of the things that I intended this list to do was to help all of us really recognize when something really sparks us, right? So I expect we have this experience. You're like, yeah, this, yeah, and yeah, this, but then whoa, right? We have this moment where something really sparks something inside of us. And I believe that if we learn to recognize that spark, then we can really start to tap into what becomes interesting for us. Because there's no one thing, right, that is interesting for everybody. Not everyone's going to be find that fact about the circulatory system interesting. Although I just am
I
fascinated
think
by
they
it.
should.
They
I
should.
think
I have no idea how this worked, Uh, so I mean, we are similar, our minds are similar in many ways, right? But what's interesting is really distinctive to us. And I think that's a great part of this unique kind of category of what we're thinking about. But it also means that we're gonna really do our best to learn about what makes things interesting but through our own experiences. And so through, even we could all pull up a list ourselves by doing a random Google search or pick up a news feed and just really pay attention to that spark of what really kind of makes you curious. And that's your signal that you're an interesting experience is going to arise, and then you can kind of just let it sink in, let it take over your mind, and then I think really learn from that. I think it's through time that we learn what's going to be interesting for us, that we can, develop and come to know ourselves through thinking about the experiences that we do find that are interesting. But I also want to say that a large part of interesting experiences comes from the unexpected. And I think that's such an important part of this. And so we don't, we can't really always plan to have interesting experiences. And, sometimes how often have we opened up a book, thought it would be interesting and just find it's not, right? So it's and that's because the interesting is often comes from unexpected things and it can be very unpredictable. And so the way to so you can't exactly plan those or pursue them in the normal ways we think about things, but you can be open to them and you can notice them when they're happening and allow yourself to have room for an unexpected experience to influence you, right? So you don't want to kind of be like, oh, this isn't what I thought this would be, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. You want to say, oh, this isn't what I thought this would be. Oh, that's kind of interesting, and give yourself the time to really take it in and see what it does to your mind. And a third thing there about how it is that we can kind of help find our interesting experiences for ourselves is to recognize that the highest things that are correlated with interesting experiences are things that are novel, challenging, or complex. So our mind reacts to experiences that have these criteria in a way that develop makes them interesting. So when we're faced with something really novel, right, our mind is forced to think new things, right? We need to wrap our heads around it. And so that will enable us to have an interesting experience just by finding something new, as well as, by embracing something challenging or complex, right? These typically, I think it's easier, it's very tempting to shy away from things that really challenge us or are complex, but if we kind of bring an open perspective to them and take in the challenge and allow our minds to engage with them, then we'll find ourselves having an interesting experience. So those three correlations that we know happen with these experiences I think are really helpful to pick up on the kinds of things that will generate interesting experiences for us, but also if we're seeking them out, just go for something novel, right? To embrace yourself in something that's challenging, right? To uh, go to a new talk or something, or watch a documentary that might be really challenging. It might bring up a wide range of emotions. It might be unpleasant. It might be difficult to think about, but let yourself do it and open your minds to it, and that'll stimulate an interesting experience.
For women in our demographic, I think that's a question that comes up a lot because they don't really know what this next chapter is going to look like. They may have raised children. They may be divorced. They may be changing a new career. So they don't know what attracts them. So I thought that was a really great example of just kind of be open to it. It doesn't have to be huge, life altering, but like you said, novel, I think is a really
Yeah.
great way to describe that. The second half of your book talks more about cultivating it. And the first part is stepping away from the pursuit mode. Now, that's a hard thing to ask of me because I'm always pursuing something. But why is it so important to step away from that pursuit mode?
Yeah, it's hard for me too. I am really part of the reason why I'm writing this book, because I've been in exactly that same spot that you just described, where we find ourselves in midlife and we're, who am I? How is this really how I want to go through the rest of my life? And I think throughout all of the career stones, the families, all of the things that are really important stages of life, they do they can leave us in this place where we find ourselves even like distant from what the things that we really care about. And so one of these things that happens is that we get very caught up in the pursuit of things. And the problem, pursuing things obviously essential, important, okay, a great way to find meaningful experiences, but it has this tendency to take over, right? When you are
Oh,
really
yes.
pursuing something, it just like it's part of our minds, right? It's that executive functioning, which is like great and super important, but it just takes over and it likes to take over. And what it does, I think, in one particular thing it does, I think, is just kind of like directs all of your mind towards the pursuit without leaving any space for you to have any other interesting thoughts. So I feel like in when we're pursuing things, we're tapping into one part of our minds. We're tapping into the part that's structured, that plans, that evaluates. And we are trained throughout our lives to think that is the most important part of our minds. So we haven't been paying attention to the other part of our minds, which is unstructured, that we can just have these unstructured thoughts, that we can engage just for the sake of engaging, right? Think about the circulatory system just for the sake of it, right? It doesn't matter where we end, right? But the point is just in engaging. It's going to really enhance our lives. So pursuit mode, I think this is probably the first and most important step for many of us to get on this kind of path towards having more interesting experiences, is to pull back pursuit mode, right? Don't allow it to take over. You're still going to get places, you're still going to be successful, but just don't allow it to occupy all of your lives, and then recognize when you've just been so caught up in pursuing something that you haven't had time for anything else. And I know, we all have demanding lives, and sometimes we'll get very caught up with something. I know I have been caught up with various work projects, with worrying about my family. And that's natural. That's going to happen. We shouldn't beat ourselves up about that, but we should also kind of like step back from that and be like, yeah, okay, time for me to have another kind of experience, right? I've really done this. And I know personally when I come out of a long period of pursuit mode, when I've worked a whole lot, when I come out of that, I do feel like my life has been impoverished, just because that's taken over so much. And, it's all about the good life happens over a life. And so it's just all about allowing yourself to recognize when something's been dominating you and to try to pull it back and allow room for other things to happen.
Sometimes it seems so difficult to do that because you place judgment on priorities of what is more important to get the pursuit finished but you're not holding space for the rest of your life. And I think that's really an important point in your book is just you need to hold that space. It's not the goal. And also you talk about the fact that the pursuit goal usually starts from a place of emptiness. And
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that so often in life we are pursuing something because we find ourselves empty without it. And so I think many of us are familiar, we can find ourselves really kind of lost and in a place where things aren't sparking for us, right? We aren't finding kind of we aren't finding passionate things to engage with, and we're just feeling like we need something more. And because of the societies we live in, right? We think that the way to fill that empty is simply to go out and pursue more and pursue the important things, right? The things that we judge to be important. And when we do those things, we will feel less empty, but but they're not going to fully satisfy us. So if we take seriously the fact that, there's only one part of our minds that pursuit mode fills, right? That evaluative, striving part of our minds, when we go out and we pursue, even when we're very successful in that, we only fulfill just one part of us. We're so much more than that. And our minds are capable of so much more. So, I think we're often driven to pursue things because we might feel empty and we think that's the only way that we'll become fulfilled or experience fullness in our lives. Yet that's a message that I think we're getting elsewhere that is just not really true. I don't think that the more we pursue or the more we achieve, the less empty we'll feel. And I think it's pretty common, and when you talk to a lot of people who've achieved even major things, that at the end of that, they're like, you know, it's a very momentary feeling that you get at that. You're like, oh, great, I just accomplished this major project, or I did this great thing, or I was working on my house for so long and I finished it, right? And then it's like, okay, well, okay, so you were satisfied, and then you feel kind of empty afterwards. And I know this happens with a lot of people in my career, with friends I know, and there's psychological explanations we can give of this, but the bottom line is, I think when we're pursuing these things, it only fulfills one part of you, and so it's not gonna, if it's emptiness that you're feeling, it's not necessarily gonna be the best bet just to kind of pursue something.
You also talk about, and I think it's important to note that when you are trying to have experiences that are more interesting, to get out of your comfort zone, there's your comfort zone, there's interesting, and then there's danger. Like jumping out of a plane isn't necessary to have an interesting experience. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that tipping point between interesting and danger?
Yes, thank you. So a lot of, if you think about what I just said about the biggest correlations with interesting experiences, right? They're challenging, they're complex, and very often we can find interesting experiences in things that are risky, right? And in things that are potentially dangerous. And depending on who we are, right? Depending on where we are, I think that it can be really easy to cross the line and just put yourself in a risky situation that you think will become interesting, But if it's too risky, then you're in your danger zone. And what happens there is that, your fight or flight systems are operating. Your mind is focused on like how can you get out of this? And you don't have that space to have an interesting experience. So to have an interesting experience, you have to get out. It helps to get out of your comfort zone and to challenge yourself and to find new things. But what we want to be aware of is when we're crossing the line from having these interesting experiences by engaging with something challenging to when we've gone to risk taking, when, we're going for perhaps like really high sensations, like that buzz you're going to get from skydiving and that's not an interesting experience, right? That's just like a sensational experience that's in the body, right? That's endorphins. And that kind of risk taking is not associated with good mental health. But so we want to be careful on what we're getting from our experiences, right? If we find ourselves going for those, then we need to pull back. And we've gone into something different, or we've gone into a danger zone. But we want to just keep our eyes on this. And for each of us, it'll be just as each of our comfort zones are unique, right? Where it is that this kind of interesting zone, which I frame in the middle, in between the comfort zone and the danger zone. There's this middle sweet spot. And we find it by kind of just pressing the boundaries of our comfort zone and becoming aware of what that feels like. And then just really making sure that we stick with the things that are really generating those feelings and are not going too far.
With respect to the danger, I also think that there are times where we seek to find experiences that are interesting, but they could be overstimulating. So, not necessarily in physical danger, but a burnout of your mind. And you also talk about this in the book.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so to have interesting experiences, they're located in our minds. Our minds need to be able to engage. So if we are overstimulated, then y- our minds are just simply not able to land on something to have that interesting experience, to be curious about, right? Interesting experiences kind of start from somewhere, right? There's some point of connection where our minds are starting to be curious, whether we've noticed something or we're forced with something challenging, our minds are starting from this position of trying to kind of engage our minds with whatever it is that we're facing. But if we can't like start from that point of noticing something or focusing on that challenging experience, then we'll not be able to have an interesting experience. So we have to pay attention to burnout, and our minds are not unlimited. Their powers are extraordinary, but they're not unlimited. And we want to recognize when, I mean, I find it, I think if we start paying attention to it, we can recognize these feelings of burnout where we can't focus, we can't land our thoughts, we can't bring that curiosity to us. And then we just need to take a break and recognize that that's not our time for an interesting experience, that we need to take a break, go back to our comfort zone, restore, and go for something interesting later.
For many people, comfort zone does not equal solitude. A lot of people are not comfortable being alone, but you talk in the book that it's important. It is important to have friends and it is important to have a strong social connection, but it's also important to be comfortable in the solitude. Why is that part of
Yeah.
the interesting experiences of life?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is so important. Relationships are hugely important to all areas of our life. So I don't want to underscore that. But I do worry that the more we think that, the less we'll be comfortable, right? Just taking time for ourselves. And when we take time for ourselves, and by this, I don't mean just like times when we're just feeling lonely, but times when we actively take time for ourselves. What we do is we allow ourselves the opportunity just to do what's really intrinsically interesting for us, right? That's all we're caring about right now. We're not trying to do something to make somebody happy or to get anywhere. We're just trying to take some time for ourselves. And so what we do when we're intentionally taking this time is that we really like or force ourselves to tap in and being like, okay, well, what would be good for me right now? And what am I interested in doing? And within this space, I think we can very easily develop or find interesting experiences, and they happen within our minds. So, social interaction can, certainly be helpful in generating these things, but we actually don't need other people to have interesting experiences. And the more that we can learn this skill of kind of recognizing when we can have some alone time, right? That we when we can take time for ourselves, and and then really recognize that we can turn that time into really valuable time by bringing our minds to something. And then, that's just a really important skill for us to have that'll enhance our lives, and it'll help us. I think it helps us develop the kind of the art of developing this capacity for interesting experiences. So it's a good place to kind of practice that. And there's lots of techniques that you can, kind of use to practice having an interesting experience when you're alone. But it's also, so I think that the benefits of solitude are then twofold, right? It's a great place to learn things about ourselves and to learn what we find interesting. But then it's also going to be really helpful to provide these skills for us that they can kick in, and then we can kind of create valuable time from this time that often gets just wasted, I think.
As we get older, too, I think we appreciate the solitude, the quiet, like you said, being able to just kind of pick and choose the experiences that we find interesting and not worry about whether we're making the kids happy, the spouse happy, the boss happy, just what we define as happiness. And that changes, it's ever
Yeah,
evolving. So,
yeah,
again, another topic. And I think it's really great at the end of the book, you do like 10, like a cheat sheet, because there is so much information, great information in the book, but this kind of like brings it all into, digestible little snippets, and I think that that's great. And it's a lot of what we talked about, just being open to the experience of interesting. And in the book, you define interesting as what we feel when we experience a robust form of cognitive engagement, full of those ripples of thoughts and emotions that evokes a variety of emotions and that itself in more interesting experiences. Can you kind of define that in layman's terms?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is just the
So
feeling
people
that
know
we.
what interesting.
Yes, totally. Yeah. So, yes, yes. There are places to be precise, but the important thing is just to get the feeling down, right?
Right.
And so an interesting experience is something that just stimulates our minds, and it allows us to be curious, to have new thoughts, and to have new feelings. And so, I like this analogy of thinking about in terms of ripples of thought, because that's essentially what it is. Our minds, they like to do this. So if we allow our minds to be curious about something, right, these ripples will happen. We'll have an interesting experience. And the key is to just let it happen. Allow yourself the space to let it happen. So by, keying into the fact of just like learning what it feels like to have an interesting experience, right? And we can do this. I mean, we've all had interesting experiences, and I think that we can, if we, think about, if everyone just now thinks about the last interesting experience they had, like what it felt like, right? Not like what they were doing when they were having the interesting experience. Just think about what it felt like for you in your minds, and like what effect that had on your minds. Then that's all it is. And I think that's, we can describe it in terms of these ripples and everything, but we really learn it when we feel it inside. And that's what I'm trying to get at there.
So less judgment and more openness to the feels. Right.
Yes, yes, yes. Less judgment for sure. More openness. Yes.
Dr. Lorraine Besser, thank you so much. The Art of Interesting, you can find it in on Amazon, any bookstore. We will have the link in our show notes, and we appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.